Welcome to Audio Classic Detective, where timeless mysteries come alive through voice, music, and imagination. Each week we bring you tales of cunning criminals and brilliant minds, of danger lurking in the drawing room and justice found in the final clue, inspired by the greats Holmes, Marple, Poirot, and more. These are the stories that shape the mystery genre as we know it. So sit back, stay sharp, and remember the answer is always there if you know where to look. Let's get started. Miss Marple and the blood-stained wedding dress. The letter arrived on a damp Tuesday morning, its envelope bearing the unmistakable flourishes of someone who had taken great pains with their handwriting. Miss Marple, seated at her breakfast table, regarded it with mild surprise before reaching for her letter opener. Invitations, particularly to weddings, were a rarity these days. Most of her friends' children had long since married, and few people thought to include a quiet elderly lady from St. Mary Mead on their guest lists. The sender was Mildred Henderson, a woman Miss Marple remembered from a long-ago church committee, competent, chatty, and inclined toward embroidery rather than gossip, which was rare for a woman of her age. Mildred's niece Lavinia was to be married at Hawthorne Grange, a stately house not far from St. Mary Mead. The family, Mildred claimed, would be delighted to have you. Though the phrasing struck Miss Marple as faintly strained, it was all rather peculiar. Miss Marple had not seen Mildred in years, and her connection to the bride was tenuous at best. Why, then, had her presence suddenly become so necessary? Tucking the invitation beside her teacup, Miss Marple resolved to accept. Her curiosity, after all, had been thoroughly piqued. The drive to Hawthorne Grange took Miss Marple past fields dappled with early spring light and narrow lanes edged with hedgerows in need of trimming. The house itself emerged at the end of a gravel path, ivy-clad, grand in a way that spoke more of faded inheritance than present wealth. At the door, a young maid answered, her nervous hands smoothing the apron over her skirt, before showing Miss Marple into the front hall. The atmosphere struck her at once, not the bustle of happy preparations, but the hushed tension of a house treading carefully around its own secrets. A portrait of a stern-faced woman hung above the mantelpiece, her gaze fixed sharply upon the room, as if judging every guest who entered. Mildred herself appeared moments later, all flutter and welcome. But Miss Marple's sharp eye noted how her smile flickered whenever the wedding was mentioned. Introductions followed. The bride, Lavinia, lovely but pale, her smile a shade too bright. The bride's brother, Julian, who hovered near the drinks table with a brooding air. And a cousin whose name Miss Marple immediately forgot, though her resentful stare was rather more memorable. It was all very charming on the surface, but beneath that polished veneer, Miss Marple could already feel a story beginning to stir. Tea was served in the morning room, the china delicate, the conversation brittle. Miss Marple, seated comfortably between Mildred and the vicar's wife, said very little, but she listened intently. Conversations here had a particular texture, one Miss Marple had come to know well over her years in villages not unlike this one. The bride's mother, Eleanor, was conspicuously absent. Someone muttered something about the headache, but the glance exchanged between Mildred and the housekeeper suggested the headache had little to do with nerves and far more to do with memory. It took very little gentle prompting for the vicar's wife, who had a fondness for scandal, to lean closer. "The mother's dress," she whispered, as though the words themselves carried weight. "The very same one her sister was meant to wear." Before it all happened, Miss Marple knew better than to ask directly. Scandals, especially those entombed beneath decades of family silence, preferred to emerge sideways, like smoke seeping from beneath a closed door. And so, while Mildred spoke loudly of the cake and the flowers, Miss Marple kept her attention on the things left unsaid, because in those silences, the real story had begun to take shape, As the afternoon drifted on, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles clicking softly, while the household circled around her like characters in a play. Lavinia fluttered between guests, her eyes darting toward the staircase whenever her mother's absence was noted. Julian spoke to no one unless spoken to, his smile unfailingly polite but always a second too slow. The housekeeper, a woman with watchful eyes and thin lips, kept to the edges of every room, her posture more that of a sentry than a servant. And Mildred, dear well-meaning Mildred, filled every silence with reassurances so over-eager they only confirmed that something was very wrong. Miss Marple knew that in houses like this, weddings and funerals often walked hand in hand. Long-held resentments, buried scandals and family secrets had a way of rising to the surface at precisely the wrong moment. What troubled her most, however, was the way everyone avoided mentioning the dress Lavinia would wear, the dress with its own unhappy history. By the time the last crumbs of seed cake had disappeared and the clock chimed 4, Miss Marple knew without question that this was no ordinary wedding, and if no one else intended to uncover why, well, she would. It was the maid who found it, just after dawn. She had gone to fetch the bridal gown from the wardrobe, her mind occupied with lists and last-minute details. But when her hands touched the fabric, she froze. The silk bodice, once pure white, was marred by an ugly rust-colored stain. A streak of blood, long dried but unmistakable. The maid stood there for a moment, breathing too fast, uncertain whether to scream or simply faint. In the end, she did neither. With trembling fingers, she carried the dress downstairs, her footsteps faltering as she entered the morning room. Mildred Henderson was the first to see it. Her teacup rattled against its saucer, spilling a thin stream of liquid onto the tablecloth. The bride's brother, Julian, stood, staring in silence, while Lavinia herself arrived moments later, her hands flying to her mouth before she could stop herself. The dress lay across the table, its stain like a wound. No one spoke at first, because no one could. The silence broke all at once. Lavinia's voice rose first, a sharp, brittle sound, as she demanded to know who had done it. Her aunt murmured reassurances, but her voice lacked conviction. Someone suggested it was a cruel prank, some childish attempt at drama. But the housekeeper's expression said otherwise. The stain was too deliberate, placed right across the heart of the dress, as if meant to be seen. The room filled with accusations wrapped in politeness. Someone muttered about the curse, others about old grudges, until the bride herself dissolved into tears sharp enough to cut. Miss Marple, knitting in her lap, said nothing at all. She watched hands twist in laps, eyes flick sideways, and voices strain to sound casual when they were anything but. It was not the prank itself that interested her, if indeed it was a prank, but the way each person reacted to it. And in those reactions, a pattern began to form. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know people reveal themselves most clearly in moments of panic. They think they are hiding their fears, but in truth, they are performing them. She noticed how Julian stood slightly apart, arms crossed, his eyes not on his sister but on the housekeeper. The housekeeper, in turn, glanced toward the sideboard drawer more than once, as though something inside it concerned her. The cousin, that bitter girl with her sharp tongue, protested too loudly, insisting that it must be a coincidence, a freak accident. But her fingers tugged endlessly at a loose thread on her sleeve, unwinding it until the hem puckered visibly. And Lavinia herself, poor child, she wept openly, but her sobs were punctuated by pauses, as though listening for something more than comfort. Miss Marple knew blood on a wedding dress would strike fear into any family, particularly one with skeletons crammed into every cupboard. But fear was one thing. Guilt was something else entirely, and there was far too much guilt in this room for one harmless prank to explain. By midday, the house had settled into uneasy factions, each group retreating into its corner. The bride's former suitor, a man with a perpetual sneer and a fondness for drink, hovered awkwardly near the window, eyes darting toward Lavinia whenever her back was turned. Julian, ever the protective brother, watched him like a cat watches a mouse. There was something about the way he spoke to Lavinia, too gentle, too rehearsed, as if trying to compensate for past harshness. The cousin, the one with the threadbare sleeve and the sharp tongue, paced the hall, muttering about inheritances and what was owed. Her grievances were no secret, though her bitterness had never seemed quite so personal until now. And the housekeeper, silent and tight-lipped, went about her work with a stiffness that suggested she knew more than she intended to reveal. Miss Marple, unnoticed in her corner, knitted steadily and listened. It was always the same in houses like this: old wounds, old loyalties, and old crimes pressing against the surface, waiting for an excuse to break free. It was later, during one of her quiet wanders through the house, that Miss Marple saw it. In the small sitting room near the back staircase, a glass display case stood slightly ajar. Inside were the usual heirlooms, silver spoons, a locket, a pair of cufflinks. But there was a gap where something had been removed. The shape of the velvet lining suggested a knife, small but ceremonial, the sort families used to cut wedding cakes in grander days. No one had mentioned a missing knife. No one, it seemed, had even noticed. But Miss Marple had. And when blood appears in unexpected places, missing knives become very interesting indeed. By evening, the household had drifted into strained silence, each occupant retreating to their private theory, their private fear. Miss Marple, seated once more with her knitting, offered her usual gentle smile to anyone who glanced her way, a smile carefully neutral, designed to reassure without revealing. But behind that smile, her thoughts moved swiftly, tracing the shape of what had begun long before this wedding day. The dress, the stain, the missing knife, they were not isolated incidents, but echoes rippling outward from a single terrible event. The true tragedy, she suspected, had not yet occurred. This was only the first act, the prelude to something much darker, and Miss Marple, in her quiet way, intended to be ready when it did. The ceremony took place in the small stone chapel on the estate grounds, the sort of place where sunlight should have filtered prettily through stained glass and caught the bride's veil with a gentle shimmer. But no one noticed the sunlight. All eyes were on Lavinia. Her hands trembled so violently that she struggled to hold her bouquet, and when the vicar spoke, her responses came either a fraction too soon or a second too late, never quite in step with the solemn rhythm of the service. The groom, a handsome man with a jaw set just a little too firmly, stood beside her, his smile polite but tight, as though his teeth were clenched behind it. There was no joy in the air, only tension, stretched thin over forced propriety. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss was brief, almost dutiful, and no one cheered as they left the chapel. Miss Marple watched from the second row, hands folded neatly in her lap. Weddings, she reflected, often revealed as much about families as funerals, though in very different ways. And this family, she suspected, was already teetering at the edge of some long-held silence ready to break. The reception unfolded in the grand dining room, tables heavy with silver trays and flowers, arranged with a precision that felt more nervous than celebratory. Guests drank champagne, but not too quickly. They laughed, but the laughter seemed to land wrong, as though everyone was following some unwritten script they were afraid to deviate from. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting untouched on her lap, observing how conversation ebbed and flowed. The vicar spoke of weather and garden fetes, avoiding all mention of the morning's unpleasant discovery. Mildred fluttered from table to table, her smile just a touch too bright, her voice pitched half an octave higher than usual. The bride's brother stood near the mantel, glass in hand, answering questions too briefly, his eyes skimming the room but never settling. And the bride herself. Lavinia's face was too pale, her laugh too quick, her gaze flickering toward her new husband with something that looked suspiciously like fear. Miss Marple had attended many village weddings. Some had been modest affairs, some grand. But this was the first she could recall, where the guests seemed determined to pretend the bride and groom weren't there at all. It was, Miss Marple had always known, in the tiniest gestures that the truth revealed itself. At one point, as champagne was refilled and a toast raised, her attention drifted to two guests seated near the window. A middle-aged man with thinning hair and a woman in a dress just a shade too youthful for her age. They avoided each other's gaze with the sort of studied indifference only people with a shared secret could manage. When their hands accidentally brushed across the table, both pulled back so quickly that a fork clattered to the floor. No one else seemed to notice, but Miss Marple did. She filed it away, alongside the way the bride's brother poured himself a second drink before the first was finished, and the way the housekeeper's face tightened whenever anyone mentioned the bride's late father. There was always a story behind these small things. The trick was knowing which thread to tug first. It was just after the cake was cut, when the guests began drifting into smaller groups, that a Mrs. Parker, a woman known for her love of a juicy whisper, sidled up to Miss Marple. "Of course," Mrs. Parker said with the air of someone imparting something she had kept to herself far too long. "There was that man, you know, last night by the garden gate." Miss Marple's brows lifted, but she said nothing. Just the faintest hum of polite interest. "Oh yes," Mrs. Parker continued. "Dark coat, hat pulled down low, just standing there. Quite sinister, really. I told my husband, but he said it was probably some delivery man lost on his way." Mrs. Parker sniffed, clearly unconvinced. "But I could feel it, you know. Something wrong about him." Miss Marple thanked her gently and returned to her chair, but her thoughts circled the tale like a cat around cream. It was not so much the lurking stranger itself that intrigued her. Village imaginations were fertile enough, but the fact that Mrs. Parker had chosen this moment to mention him, that, Miss Marple thought, was rather more interesting than the stranger himself. The day wound on, but the atmosphere never truly relaxed. Conversations grew quieter, the guests drifted into tighter circles, and more than one glance was cast toward the blood-stained dress, now conspicuously absent from view. Miss Marple noticed all this, but what troubled her most was the absence of a question, the one that should have been asked the moment the dress was discovered. Not who had stained it, or even why. No. The question no one dared to ask was whose blood it was. That was the sort of question that could only remain unspoken when the answer was too terrible to face. And Miss Marple, with her quiet knitting and her sharper-than-needles mind, knew that somewhere beneath all this brittle cheer, someone already knew exactly whose blood it was. They were simply waiting for the right moment to confess, or to be caught. The laughter came first, too loud, too brittle, echoing awkwardly across the drawing room. Glasses were raised, toasts offered, and for a fleeting moment it almost resembled a celebration. The bridesmaid stood near the center of the room, her fingers curled around the slender stem of a champagne flute. Her smile was fixed, a smile that wanted to belong but never quite did. She lifted the glass to her lips, took a delicate sip, and then staggered backwards, the color draining from her face like ink seeping from damp paper. There was no scream, no dramatic collapse, only the soft clatter of the glass slipping from her fingers and the whisper of fabric as she crumpled to the floor. For the briefest moment, no one moved. It was as though the entire room held its breath, caught between disbelief and the dreadful certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. And then came the rush of voices, the scrape of chairs, and the sound of someone sobbing quietly in the corner. Miss Marple, seated near the door, set down her knitting with calm precision. Some tragedies announce themselves with fanfare. Others arrive quietly, wearing the face of an ordinary afternoon. The room dissolved into chaos, the kind that only comes when order has been clung to for far too long. The bride stumbled forward, her sobs high and thin, while her aunt called out for the doctor, who, of course, wasn't there. The groom hovered uselessly, hands trembling at his sides, and the housekeeper, normally so composed, spilled half a bottle of smelling salts across the carpet. In the midst of it all, Miss Marple slipped quietly to the side table, retrieving the fallen champagne glass with hands far steadier than anyone else's. She raised the glass to her nose, inhaling softly. Beneath the scent of cheap celebration wine, there was something else, faint, bitter, unmistakable. Poison, she thought. Not the dramatic kind beloved in novels, but something far subtler, a whisper of bitterness hidden within bubbles and sentiment. She said nothing, of course. There was no need. Panic would do its work, sending blame ricocheting around the room like a trapped bird. Miss Marple's job was not to add to the noise. Her job was to listen through it. It was only when the doctor finally arrived, too late to be of any use, that the whispering began. Miss Marple heard it first from a cousin with loose morals and a looser tongue, muttered behind a handkerchief, scented heavily with lavender. "The dress," she said. "The cursed dress. It had been worn before. By the dead woman's mother at her own wedding. And that wedding," the cousin added, "had ended just as badly. Not with her poisoning, but with her death all the same. Her fall, her broken neck, a night everyone preferred to forget. It was superstition dressed up as scandal, exactly the sort of tale villagers cling to when the truth is too inconvenient. But Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss it entirely. In her experience, the past was never truly finished. It sat in parlors and parlor maids alike, waiting for its invitation back into the present. The bride's mother, still conspicuously absent, had not touched the champagne. Miss Marple filed that detail away. And with it, the certainty that this wedding was not merely haunted by its own ghosts, but by the very people who had created them. Evening drew in, softening the edges of the house with shadows that seemed to know too much. Guests had drifted home, leaving behind only the family and their private miseries. Miss Marple settled once again with her knitting, reflected that small villages never truly forget anything. They might pretend, with flowers and fetes and polite conversation, but the past always finds its way home. She had seen it before. An argument left unresolved, a letter never delivered, a shame hidden under a coat of fresh paint. Time was a thin veil, and beneath it, everything waited. The wedding dress, its stain dried now to a darker shade, lay folded in the corner, a relic of two tragedies, not one. Miss Marple understood something very important about human nature. People could forgive much if you gave them time, but they never forgave being made to remember. And this wedding, this unhappy farce, had made everyone remember things they had spent a lifetime forgetting. That, she thought, was more dangerous than any poison. Long after most had retired for the night, Miss Marple asked the housekeeper for a quiet moment with the dress. The woman hesitated, then relented, relieved perhaps to hand the cursed thing to someone else. Miss Marple unfolded the silk with careful hands, her fingers tracing the fresh stain first, the one everyone had seen. But it was the second stain, fainter, older, that interested her most. It sat lower, near the hem, darkened with time, the shape irregular and yet oddly familiar. Blood, she knew. But from when? From whom? The past and present had bled into each other, staining the same fabric, tying two tragedies into one seamless piece of cloth. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. There was something deliberate here, not mere accident. Someone had wanted the past remembered. But for what purpose? Revenge? Remorse? Or something far more subtle? She folded the dress once more, her hands gentle as if laying a shroud over a corpse. When the police arrived, polite and slightly pompous, they took statements with the air of men certain they were dealing with hysteria, not murder. Miss Marple gave her account pleasantly enough, adding nothing more than was necessary. But her real attention was fixed on one particular guest, a woman seated by the fire, her hands clasped just a little too tightly in her lap. Her grief was precise, the kind that knew exactly how much to show and when. Her smile, when she spoke of the dead woman, trembled at all the right moments. But it was the instant she thought herself unobserved that gave her away. The smile vanishing into blankness, her mouth set into a line of careful calculation. It was not grief, Miss Marple thought, but something far colder. The relief of a gambler whose risky hand had not yet been called. The dress, the poison, the past. All threads knotted tightly around her. The only question left was which knot Miss Marple needed to tug first. And quietly, with a slight adjustment of her knitting needles, Miss Marple decided she would tug them all. It began, as such things often do, with whispers, first at the village shop, then outside the church, and finally, in low voices, exchanged across neatly trimmed hedges. The family, they said, was cursed, not in a dramatic, theatrical way, with ghostly footsteps or spectral visions, but in the quiet, insidious fashion that only village memory can conjure. Every bride in that family, from Lavinia's mother to her mother's mother, had walked toward the altar under a shadow. And every time before the ink dried in the register, something had gone terribly wrong. A tragic elopement, a father who disowned his daughter on her wedding morning, a bride who disappeared before the wedding breakfast, only to be found hours later, her gown torn and bloodstained beside the river. No one remembered the full stories. Not exactly. But the scraps were enough to terrify. Enough to feed the sense that Lavinia's fate had been written, long before she ever accepted the proposal. Miss Marple, seated quietly on her usual bench outside the post office, heard every word. Villages had long memories, after all. And this particular memory, she thought, had been kept unusually sharp, as though someone had never wanted it to fade at all. The postmistress had always been fond of a story, particularly if it could be told over tea and with the vicar's wife conveniently present to add embellishments of moral outrage. Miss Marple sat opposite them, her expression mild and interested, hands folded neatly around her cup, her mind filing every word like evidence in a case long unsolved. It had started, the postmistress said, with a romance the family disapproved of. The bride's mother, Eleanor, still pale and silent upstairs, had fallen in love with a man her father despised. On the morning of her wedding, with the flowers already arranged and the guests seated, she had fled, out the side door, veil askew, hands trembling. There had been a sister, too, the one no one spoke of anymore, the sister who had loved the same man. She had stayed behind, wearing the dress her sister abandoned, standing in the place her sister had vacated. only to end the day not as a wife, but as a corpse. The vicar's wife shook her head, clucking softly, blaming youth and rashness. Miss Marple, however, knew better. There was no rashness in tragedies that left stains lasting generations. People spoke of curses because it was easier than admitting they remembered exactly who had done what and why. And somewhere beneath layers of scandal and silence, the truth had been waiting, just as patiently as Miss Marple herself. The dress lay across Miss Marple's knees that afternoon. The house temporarily quiet, the household worn thin with grief and speculation. Her fingers moved with a gentle, practiced precision, tracing seams that had been unpicked and restitched too many times, until at last they found something the seamstress had not intended anyone to discover. Tucked inside the lining, between lace and silk, was a single folded letter, its edges yellowed with time. The handwriting, though faded, spoke of desperation, the kind only found in letters never meant to be hidden. It was a plea, written by the sister who had once stood in that dress, a plea to the man she and her sister both loved, begging him to understand why she had taken her sister's place. There were no accusations in the letter, no jealous bitterness, only a quiet sorrow, a resignation that, in choosing duty over desire, she had stepped willingly toward her own undoing. Miss Marple folded the letter once more, placing it back where she found it. Some secrets, she knew, were best left to the dead, but others, especially those that tied past to present so neatly, had a habit of demanding their due. This dress was no mere garment. It was a message in plain sight, and someone, Miss Marple suspected, had understood that long before today. Later that evening, back in her room with only her knitting for company, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet moment to consider the weight of time. There was a cruelty, she reflected, in the way some wounds refused to close, no matter how carefully they were covered. Families passed down heirlooms and recipes, but they also passed down resentments and betrayals, quietly preserved like pressed flowers inside forgotten books. The tragedy at the heart of this family was not a curse. It was something far older, the consequence of people who had made the wrong choices for what they believed were the right reasons. And such things, Miss Marple knew, never truly vanish. They merely wait for the next generation to reopen the door. As she set aside her knitting and extinguished the light, Miss Marple was certain of only one thing. This was no ghost story. This was a living tragedy, playing out with all the inevitability of a play that had been rehearsed for years. And the final act, she suspected, had not yet arrived. It was the housemaid who found it, sent up to the attic by the housekeeper, in search of spare linen. She had grumbled about the dust and the spiders, but her protests died the moment she opened the trunk. Inside lay a wedding dress, carefully folded, its silk yellowed with age. But it was not the color that caught the maid's eye. It was the stain, dark and brittle, spreading across the bodice like a wound that had never fully closed. The maid carried the dress downstairs with both hands, as though it might crumble to dust if she breathed too hard. By the time Miss Marple saw it, the housemaid's voice had risen half an octave, and her face was the color of old milk. Another blood-stained dress, resting silently above their heads all these years. The past, it seemed, had not been buried at all. It had simply been folded away, waiting for someone to open the lid. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly against her knitting. She had suspected for some time that this was a story with a long tail. But even she had not expected that tale to reach quite so far back. The dress, it was said, belonged to Eleanor, the bride's mother, the woman whose own wedding had ended in whispers, and whose absence from her daughter's reception had been pointedly ignored. Eleanor had worn the dress on the day she stood at the altar, not with the man she had loved, but with the one her father insisted upon. By evening there had been an accident, or so the story went. A broken goblet, a cut hand, blood on the dress. But in villages like this, blood never stays just blood. It becomes an omen, a story retold until fact becomes folklore. By the time Miss Marple heard the tale, the details had changed so many times that no one quite remembered what had actually happened, only that it had ended very badly indeed. Now, here was the dress itself, silent proof that the past was not content to rest. Miss Marple traced the old stain with one finger, noting the way the silk had stiffened beneath it. Some stains, she thought, could be scrubbed away. Others had to be faced. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat quietly in the library, both dresses spread before her, the old and the new, side by side. She did not rush. Years of quiet observation had taught her that patterns only reveal themselves to those willing to wait. The stains, she noted, were not random. Both began at the left shoulder, spreading down across the heart, almost identical in shape and placement. Not the careless spill of wine or the accidental smudge of makeup, but something deliberate, something intended to be seen. It was not a curse, Miss Marple realized. It was a message sent across time in the language of stain and silk, a silent accusation stitched into fabric. Someone had understood exactly what that old dress meant. Someone had seen it not as a relic, but as a weapon, and had chosen to recreate the crime on this wedding day, forcing everyone to remember what they had tried so hard to forget. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. This was not the first time guilt had dressed itself in white. It was the housekeeper who found the veil, crumpled beneath the bed in the best man's room. Torn lace, its edges uneven, as though ripped in a hurry. The discovery spread through the house like ink through water. The best man, a childhood friend of the groom, and once, some said, a suitor to the bride herself, was dragged from his breakfast plate, pale and defensive, spluttering denials before anyone had formally accused him. "I've never seen it before," he said, though his hands trembled as he spoke. "Why would I? What possible reason could I have for taking her veil?" The groom's face darkened with suspicion. The bride's brother stood too quickly, nearly overturning his chair. It was all very theatrical, exactly the sort of thing that happens when fear searches for a scapegoat. Miss Marple, meanwhile, said nothing. She simply watched the best man's hands, noting the way they curled into fists whenever anyone mentioned the blood-stained dress. He was hiding something, yes. But Miss Marple suspected it was the wrong something. There was guilt there, certainly. But it was the guilt of a man who has seen too much, rather than the guilt of one who has done too much. She kept her own counsel, knowing that the first suspect is rarely the right one, especially when the evidence is just a bit too convenient. That evening, while the household whispered itself into frenzied certainty, Miss Marple sat beside the fire, her knitting once again in her lap. They were all so sure the best man was to blame. It was tidy after all. Convenient. Too convenient. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime watching human beings cover their tracks. The guilty rarely left such obvious trails. A torn veil under the bed was not a clue. It was an invitation. Someone wanted the blame to fall in the most obvious place. The true culprit, Miss Marple knew, was someone who understood how quickly people leaped to conclusions. Someone who knew the family history well enough to exploit it, recreating the stain, planting the veil, turning a family tragedy into a perfect distraction. She sipped her tea, her expression mild. Guilty people, she knew, often smiled the hardest, desperate to appear innocent. And somewhere in this house, someone was smiling just a little too much. The guest book sat on a side table near the entrance hall, bound in dark leather, its pages thick with the weight of decades of careful handwriting. Miss Marple requested it with a smile, claiming she thought it might be helpful to check the guest list. Perhaps someone had left early or forgotten to sign entirely. The housekeeper, too exhausted to question her, fetched it without comment. The truth, of course, was rather different. Miss Marple had no particular interest in who had attended the wedding. She was not searching for the present, but for the past, and the places where the two had quietly overlapped. Names, she knew, had a curious habit of drifting through time. Sometimes they appeared where they should not. Sometimes they vanished entirely, leaving only a gap where a life should have been. As she turned the pages, Miss Marple's fingers moved lightly, careful not to crease or smudge. It was an old habit, born of understanding that sometimes the smallest smudge can hide the most inconvenient truth. Somewhere in this innocent book, she suspected, lay a name no one expected to find. A name that had no business signing anything at all. Halfway down the page, beneath a flourish of congratulations and the usual polite sentiments, Miss Marple found the name. It was not a common name, nor one likely to be repeated by accident. It was the name of a woman who, according to village memory, had been dead for nearly 30 years, Margaret Henderson. Miss Marple paused only briefly, her expression giving nothing away. Margaret, the bride's aunt, the sister who had once stood at the altar, wearing the very dress that now lay folded in disgrace upstairs. The sister who, by every account, had died tragically, not long after the wedding that never should have happened. The signature was clear and confident, the ink fresh. This was not a relic from a forgotten page, nor a simple clerical error. Someone had written it deliberately, knowing precisely the effect it would have if it were ever noticed. Miss Marple knew only one kind of person leaves a ghost's signature. Someone who wants to remind the living that the past still breathes, and that no matter how many curtains are drawn, it will not be shut out. Carefully she closed the guest book, placing her hands gently upon the cover, as if to seal the truth inside. There are two kinds of ghosts, Miss Marple reflected as she sat by the fire later that evening. There are the ghosts that people invent, stories whispered after dark to explain misfortune or coincidence, the kind that haunt hearths and hallways without ever truly existing. And then there are the ghosts that walk on 2 feet, carrying their secrets into each new day, unable or unwilling to let the living forget. This, Miss Marple knew, was not a haunting born of superstition. It was something much worse, an unfinished story, one whose final page had never been written because no one had the courage to put pen to paper. The past in this house had been stitched into every seam, hidden behind every polite smile. Each generation had inherited not just property, but silence, passing it down as if it were a family treasure. The stain on the dress was not fate. It was a message from the dead, or perhaps from the living who wished they were forgotten. Miss Marple understood something that others rarely did. Time does not heal what it refuses to admit. And in houses like this, the past does not rest. It waits. The next morning Miss Marple visited the vicar, her request made so gently that it hardly seemed important. "Would you, dear?" she said, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Mind fetching the parish record for the year Margaret Henderson was meant to marry? There's a small matter I'd like to check." The vicar, accustomed to Miss Marple's peculiar interests, did not question her. He merely fetched the heavy leather volume, placing it before her on the table with the quiet reverence usually reserved for Bibles and wills. Miss Marple turned the pages with care, her finger tracing each entry with the patience of someone used to untangling old threads. Births, banns, marriages, each line a small piece of the village's story. When she found what she was looking for, she allowed herself only the smallest smile, the sort that no one would think to question. It was not the wedding entry itself that interested her. It was the amendment made afterwards, in handwriting far shakier than the rest. A name crossed out, a correction made. The past had never been buried at all, Miss Marple realized. It had simply been edited, in the hope that no one would ever bother to look again. They had not counted on her. The house had finally settled, its uneasy silence broken only by the occasional creak of an aging floorboard or the distant chime of a clock marking the hour. It was then, with her shawl drawn around her shoulders, that Miss Marple made her way quietly along the corridor. She had observed Eleanor, the bride's mother, throughout the evening, noting the way her hands trembled as she poured tea, how her gaze darted away whenever someone mentioned the dress. There was guilt there, but not the ordinary kind. This was the guilt of someone haunted not by what others knew, but by what they did not. Eleanor opened her bedroom door at the first knock, her expression a mixture of relief and dread. She had been waiting, Miss Marple realized. Not for a visit in particular, but for the moment her silence could no longer hold. Without prompting, Miss Marple stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old perfume, a room belonging to someone who remembered happier days and had spent every year since pretending they still existed. Eleanor's hands twisted together, knuckles white. "I suppose," she said quietly. "It's time you knew." Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing a delicate embroidered edge of the coverlet, a movement so habitual it spoke of years spent distracting herself from darker thoughts. "It was meant to be my sister's dress," she began, her voice thin and reedy. "But on the morning of her wedding, she disappeared. There had been a terrible argument the night before, whispers of a secret lover, a desperate plan to escape before the vows could be spoken. My father was furious," Eleanor said. "He told me I would have to take her place." Miss Marple listened, her hands folded in her lap, her expression as gentle as an old friend come to offer comfort. Eleanor spoke of how the ceremony went on, how a sudden accident at the reception left her sister dead in the garden. A fall, they said. Blood had spattered the dress Eleanor wore, the dress meant for someone else. "It was a curse," Eleanor whispered. "That dress brought nothing but death." Tears glistened in her eyes. But Miss Marple knew tears alone do not make a story true. This confession had the shape of honesty. But there was something too careful about the telling, as though the truth had been trimmed to fit the moment. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime listening to confessions of all kinds. Guilty people often overspoke, too eager to unburden themselves. The innocent, on the other hand, often said too little, afraid to sound defensive. But the most interesting confessions were the ones that felt rehearsed, crafted not to reveal the truth but to steer the listener away from it. Eleanor's confession was one of those. She spoke fluently, too fluently, as though she had told herself this story many times, enough to believe it herself. But there were gaps, small ones, where her voice caught for just a second too long. Certain names left unspoken, certain events referenced but not explained. Miss Marple made no comment. She simply nodded in all the right places, her face kind but unreadable. People often mistook her silence for simplicity, but, in truth, it was her sharpest tool. What Eleanor described might be true, but it was not the whole truth. Miss Marple could always recognize the shape of a half-truth. It was like a pattern missing its final stitch, functional but never quite complete. She rose at last, offering Eleanor's trembling hand a gentle squeeze. "Try to rest," she said softly. "These things always look clearer in the morning." What neither woman knew was that someone else stood just beyond the door, pressed against the wall, half hidden by shadow. Was a figure whose breath came shallow and quick, ears straining to catch every whispered word. Confessions, after all, were not only for clearing the conscience. Sometimes they made for very useful tools. Miss Marple, for all her observation, had not missed the sense that someone else in this house wanted the truth twisted, wanted guilt laid at the wrong feet. What better way to do so than by eavesdropping on a confession, repeating only what suited the story? The figure crept back down the corridor, careful not to disturb a single creaking board. The house was full of guilt, but guilt does not always mean murder. Sometimes it only means fear. Fear that old secrets might rise to the surface just 1 inch too far. Miss Marple, returning to her own room, paused once in the hall. The air was just slightly disturbed, like a curtain recently drawn or a presence that had only just slipped away. She said nothing, but her smile was thinner than usual. By morning, the confession had spread like ink spilled across a page. The housekeeper heard it from the maid, who heard it from the cousin, who heard it from nowhere at all. Because stories like this do not need a source to take on a life of their own. Conveniently, Eleanor's confession fit too well. It explained the dress, the blood, the curse. It provided a history that tied itself up in a neat little bow, leaving nothing for anyone to question. Miss Marple sat at breakfast, buttering her toast with the air of a woman not fooled in the slightest. She had heard many confessions in her time, and the ones that seemed too perfect, too satisfyingly complete, were always the ones hiding the real crime beneath them. The truth, she suspected, had been carefully trimmed away, leaving only what someone wanted the world to see. Later that afternoon, with her knitting settled comfortably in her lap, Miss Marple reflected quietly. The real story was not in what Eleanor had confessed, but in what she had left out. The names never spoken, the moments that had been carefully sidestepped. Her true confession is rarely neat. It spills over itself, messy and human, like a drawer emptied in a hurry. Eleanor's confession, by contrast, was tidy, shaped with deliberate care, leaving only what could be safely known. Miss Marple had no doubt Eleanor carried guilt, but guilt for what exactly? That was the question. The dress, the curse, the tragedy. It was all true enough, but it was not the heart of the matter. The real truth, Miss Marple knew, was always in the untold detail, the one thread deliberately snipped before the story was presented. And somewhere in this house, someone knew exactly which thread it was. It was Miss Marple herself who made the request, a polite but firm suggestion that the entire household gather in the drawing room that afternoon. No one declined. By now, tension had built to the point where silence had become unbearable, and the thought of answers, any answers, was preferable to the dark uncertainty that clung to every corner of the house. They assembled like unwilling players in a play they had not rehearsed, each uncertain of their role, but all too aware that the curtain was about to rise. The bride sat nearest the hearth, her fingers curled tightly around a handkerchief, already reduced to threads. The groom stood beside her, jaw clenched so tightly that a vein flickered in his temple. Eleanor, pale and drawn, avoided her daughter's gaze altogether. Miss Marple, by contrast, sat serene in her usual chair, her hands resting lightly upon her knitting. There was no flourish, no drama in her voice when she began to speak. That, after all, was not her way. Truth, she had always found, carried its own weight. What mattered now was who would have the strength to face it. Miss Marple began, not with accusation but with a story. A story about how curses are made, not by fate, but by people. People who cannot bear their own guilt and so weave it into myth, until even they believe it is destiny, not their own actions, that brought ruin upon them. She traced the so-called curse of the dress back to its origins, not to some ghostly vengeance but to a broken engagement, a bitter father, and a daughter forced to marry the wrong man. The blood-stained dress had been a consequence, not a prophecy. The tragedies that followed, a sister's death, whispered betrayals, vanished letters, each had been a choice made by living hands. There was no curse, Miss Marple explained gently. There was only a series of people too afraid to tell the truth, and too quick to blame the past for their present misery. Superstition had become a shield, protecting not the innocent her, but the guilty. The one person who knew that if you give people a ghost to chase, they'll never look for a murderer. Miss Marple spoke calmly, her voice steady as she laid out the sequence of events. The dress, laid out in the morning room, had not been placed there by accident. It had been deliberately displayed to provoke hysteria, knowing full well the family's fear of the so-called curse. It was not a warning from the past, but a clever manipulation of the present. As panic spread, attention shifted away from what truly mattered, the champagne glass. No one noticed the subtle bitterness that lingered at its rim, because they were too busy chasing shadows sewn into silk. By the time the bridesmaid raised her glass, the poison was already doing its work. And once she collapsed, no one questioned that the curse had claimed its latest victim. The blood-stained dress had been the perfect distraction, a relic so steeped in fear that no one thought to ask the simplest question of all. Who had poured her drink? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. The family had been so busy fearing ghosts, they had overlooked the very real hand that delivered death. The dress was never the point. Miss Marple continued. It was a smokescreen, a magician's flourish, a way to ensure that everyone's eyes were drawn to the past, while the killer hid comfortably in the present. They understood this family too well, their fears, their secrets, their eagerness to blame fate rather than each other. They knew that all it would take was a single gesture, the dress laid out, stained just so, and the household would fall into predictable chaos. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a crime built on psychology rather than opportunity, a manipulation not of circumstance, but of fear itself. And in that sense, the dress had been the perfect weapon, not to kill, but to blind everyone to the real crime unfolding before their eyes. It was Julian, the bride's own brother, who stood, face pale, when Miss Marple finally spoke his name. It had been jealousy, yes, but not the ordinary kind. Julian had spent his whole life living in the shadow of a sister, whose marriage had been planned from the cradle, whose future had always been brighter, more important than his own. But there was more. The family finances were in ruin, and marriage into wealth was meant to save them all. Except Julian had recently discovered the truth, that the inheritance promised to the bride had never truly existed. It was a myth, just like the curse. The only real wealth had belonged to the bridesmaid, whose sudden death made Julian the last viable heir. He had poisoned her drink, planting the dress to ensure no one would look too closely at the glass. After all, why suspect the living when the dead had already claimed the blame? Julian's voice broke once, protesting his innocence, but his trembling hands gave him away. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of the mantel clock, a sound Miss Marple had always found comforting, though few others did. Murder, she reflected, was rarely about one thing. It was never just about money or revenge. It was always a tangle of motives, old wounds, petty resentments, and a need to be seen or heard after too long in the shadows. In this case, it was also a cruel twist of poetic justice. Julian had used the family curse, the very myth that had always reduced him to a footnote in his sister's life, to commit the crime that would finally put him at the center of the story. But even that was a kind of folly, for stories never end where their authors intend. And now, instead of being remembered for unmasking the family curse, Julian would be remembered for proving there had never been one at all. Miss Marple folded her hands, her work complete. The tragedy, she thought, was not that the family believed in curses, it was that they had believed in each other so very little. The morning after the truth came to light, the wedding was no longer spoken of as a celebration, but as a cautionary tale. The bride stood pale and hollow-eyed as her brother was taken away, his wrists shackled by the very hands that had once lifted her onto his shoulders as a child. The groom's family, stiff with embarrassment, made their excuses and left before breakfast was even served. There was no farewell toast, no fond wishes for a happy future, only murmured speculation and the quick furtive glances that come when people see scandal unfold before their eyes. Amidst it all, Miss Marple slipped away. No fuss, no formal farewell. Just a gentle word to the housekeeper and a promise to write. Though both knew, neither would ever mention this wretched wedding again. Scandals, Miss Marple reflected, are like stains on silk. No amount of washing ever truly removes them. And this particular stain, woven through generations, had at last bled out into the open, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. The train back to St. Mary Mead rattled along its tracks, carrying Miss Marple through fields, bright with morning mist, and villages untouched by the troubles of Hawthorne Grange. She sat by the window, hands folded lightly in her lap, her face composed but her mind turning over all she had seen and heard. It was always the same, she thought. Behind every well-dressed family, behind every polished silver tea service, there lay secrets, some small and harmless, others dark enough to destroy whole households. The tragedy of the wedding, Miss Marple knew, was not the murder alone. It was the years of silence that had made it possible, the way a single lie, left unchallenged, had grown into a legend, until truth itself had no place within those walls. The countryside rolled past, and with each mile the weight of Hawthorne Grange slipped further away. But some part of Miss Marple knew that stories like this never truly end. They simply wait, biding their time until some future generation opens the wrong drawer or asks the wrong question. Back in her own sitting room, with a pot of strong Darjeeling at her elbow and her knitting needles clicking softly, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. People, she thought, were so very fond of blaming fate. Curses, omens, bad luck, all so much easier to accept than the simple truth that human nature itself is the most dangerous inheritance of all. Jealousy, pride, fear, they pass from parent to child as surely as heirlooms and recipes. In the end, it was not a ghost that had poisoned that poor girl's champagne, nor was it a curse that had stained the dress with blood. It was ordinary human spite, sharpened by years of resentment, given just enough opportunity to become murder. Miss Marple had seen it too many times to be shocked. People believed that in villages like St. Mary Mead, or grand houses like Hawthorne Grange, evil comes from outside, sneaking in like a thief in the night. They never suspect that it's already there, sitting at the breakfast table smiling across the wedding cake, tied to them by blood or love or loyalty gone sour. She took another sip of tea, her expression placid. But her thoughts, as always, ran far deeper. Just as she was setting aside her knitting, her mind preparing to close the chapter, a small detail floated to the surface: the missing brooch. The family heirloom, a delicate sapphire and pearl piece, had sat in a glass case near the staircase until it was found gone, just hours before the first blood-stained dress appeared. It had been dismissed in the chaos, chalked up to a careless maid or a misplaced trinket. But Miss Marple knew better. In a house where every object told a story, a missing heirloom was not a matter of chance. She leaned back, her knitting forgotten, her tea cooling beside her. The case was solved, or at least the part everyone wanted solved. The murder had been explained, the culprit removed, the story tied up neatly. And yet, the brooch. Some stories, Miss Marple knew, do not end when the curtain falls. They leave a thread hanging, waiting for someone patient enough to pick it up. Miss Marple smiled to herself, knowing that one day, perhaps at some future wedding, that thread would be tugged again. After all, she thought, nothing stays buried forever. Every family has its secrets. Some are harmless, tucked away in old letters and faded photographs. But others, like the ones hidden at Hawthorne Grange, grow heavier with each generation, passed down not as memories, but as curses in disguise. In the end, there were no ghosts haunting the halls, no supernatural curse darkening the bride's future. Just human hands, human fears, and human hearts, twisted by jealousy, fear, and long-held resentment. The blood-stained dress wasn't a warning from the beyond. It was a message from the living, using the weight of family legend to cover a very real crime. But here's the unsettling truth. How often do we do the same? How many times do we explain away the uncomfortable things in our families, in our own lives, as fate? And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think.